I want to welcome you to this webinar on It's the Manager, as you can see. And we are very fortunate to have Tyke Lee from Gallup, Omaha, Nebraska, on the line with us. Yendor Falgate, who is a Gallup certified coach as well as the lead trainer for Gallup's Accelerated Strengths Coaching Program in Africa. And you are joining Yendor and myself here in very cold Johannesburg in South Africa. Just a couple of things. If you want to ask a question and you want to make sure that your question doesn't get lost in the chat room, just go to the bottom of your Zoom window. You will see there a Q&A. Just click on the Q&A and ask your question. I'll make sure that we answer it. Also, if you just want to say hi, feel free to put it in the Zoom webinar chat. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to hand over to Yendor Falgate, who will do an introduction to Tyke Lee. And about 15 minutes to 4, we will be doing a Q&A. So have your questions ready, and let's get this chat going. Thank you very much, Yendor.
Thanks very much, Margriet, for that kind introduction. This is always a bit weird because you have 65 people, now 66 on the other end of the line. We can't see you guys, but obviously you can engage with us. If you're a bit confused, I'm the devilishly handsome guy on the left-hand side. If you're facing your screen, Take is the other one in the middle, and of course, nobody can confuse Margriet. She's on a little bit of the hazy island view on the right-hand side. We're delighted to be with you today. This is our first opportunity to engage with South Africa in a webinar format, and we're very proud to have Gallup on the line. So we're bringing Gallup to your home, and if you were wise, you're probably sitting at home with a cup of coffee in your slippers, hoping to be bedazzled by the insights that Take is going to bring to us today. The format is quite informal. What we are trying to bring to everybody is just some of the great research Gallup has brought to the world. I've just come back from the Gallup conference where we saw some really great research and I think some meaningful stuff that Take will be sharing with you in the big shift that we see in workplaces, and particularly in South African workplaces. By way of introduction, Take Lee is a regional director for Gallup. He's probably blushing now if you can imagine him sitting in Omaha, but he's had many years' experience both being a trainer, a consultant, a Gallup coach, and now looks after, amongst other things, the regional partner network for Gallup. One of the things that I'm hoping that he'll bring to the party this afternoon is some of his deep insights as to how the world of work is changing in the developing markets. Of course, I will be to help him out should you be asking any strange South African questions or in Afrikaans. So we can certainly help out with that, and I can do some translation if that is required. But please have your questions ready, and the way to think about this always is to make sure that you take the tough ones. So if we can agree on that, that is fantastic. Take, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add to your the short introduction, or would you like to just take it away?
I think we're good to just take it away, Yendor. Thank you very much, Yendor, Margriet. Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be on today to discuss our latest book. It's called It's the Manager. I'll talk a little bit about the book, the format, but mostly I would like to talk about really the research behind it. The book is written by our chairman and CEO, Jim Clifton, and our chief scientist, Dr. Harder. But if you really go into the book is really written to be read more as I would say a manual. I know a lot of folks have already read it from front to back, but it's really, if you look at it, it's 52 of our most key findings around the future of the workplace, and it's meant for leaders, managers, or anyone to really look at it as manuals based on the specific topics or any of the things that they're facing in their organizations. The book itself covers areas around like strategies, what should CEOs, CHROs be thinking about when it comes to, like human capital, people in the workplace, things like that. Talks a lot about culture, culture in organizations, why culture matters, and how to change culture. Talks about employment brand, which is key in terms of attracting, retaining, and developing people in their organizations. And it talks about a concept called boss to coach, which I'll talk a lot more about later, and it really references back to the title, which is It's the Manager. And then it goes very deep into what we call the future of work. But really, if you look at all the 52 points, it really kind of goes back to a few years ago. You know, Gallup as an organization, we work with a lot of enterprise clients across the globe and clients of organizations of all sizes. And, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago, one of the biggest themes that we were coming across as a really big business problem was around this generational gap with millennials and baby boomers. So that set off a research, and you can find this research called, you know, on millennials on our website. But, you know, there were some very interesting findings. At the time, it was the largest millennial study that was done. And I would say it really set the tone for the direction of our research within the workplace, which then led to, you know, things around the future of the workplace, understanding what kind of disruptions are coming, understanding how does the millennial generation's need in the workplace differs from previous generations, and most importantly, what is really the role of the manager, you know, in relation to all that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our millennials research, which goes into our 6 key findings, and then I'll basically relate that to the other topics within the book. So, you know, the millennials research really started off in us trying to understand, you know, what is this, why are organizations struggling today, or let's say 4 or 5 years ago, and I would say even today, with this generational gap, right? And if you think about the millennials, even a few years ago, there was, you know, they were tagged with a lot of different, I would say, connotations, right? So to call them the me generation, job hoppers, to you name it, right? No commitment, all these different things. And we thought, you know what? Someone should really go try to understand what's going on here, right? And if you look at the history of Gallup, you know, we started as an organization that polled, and we're really after, you know, what people were thinking, and it goes back 80 years, right? And of all the polling that we've done throughout the 80 years, there's one question that we've asked consistently, and we found some interesting changes in people's thinking every, let's say, about 20 years. And that question is really trying to understand what is the will of the people, right? So what is the most important thing to you in life? And if you look back 80, 60 years ago, there were things like around, you know, like independence, peace, various different topics, which is really related to, I would say, that era. And when you get to the baby boomers, there's a subtle change in what people consider the most important thing. Baby boomers, when you ask them, what is the most important thing to you in life? They would say, well, it's my family, right? You know, I wanna have a wife, kids, nice house, a car, a dog, you know, you name it. And when we ask them, okay, well, what about your job? They would say, you know what? I mean, it's just a means to having a great family, right? So, you know, all I really need is a paycheck. You know, I want to be satisfied. I want to have a good boss. You know, give me a good annual review. Tell me, you know, what areas I need to do better in, and you know, it's just a job. Right? So it doesn't matter what I do, as long as I can provide and have the means to providing and having a great family. And that stays pretty consistent until we get to the millennials generation. And interestingly, it seems like a very subtle change, but you know, this is really what kind of triggers everything in terms of, you know, what's the need in the workplace today. So when we start asking the millennial generation, what is the most important thing to you in life? They no longer say family, and we know family is very important, but they actually say it's their job. So we thought, wow, that's interesting. We went from people saying family is the most important thing to now this new generation, they're saying, well, it's my job. And the most interesting part of all that is that, well, we know millennials as job hoppers, non-committal, all these various things, yet they're saying job is the most important thing. So we thought, okay, something's wrong. This is a great point for us to really start research and dig into what's going on. It's a very long research report that you can read if you'd like, but our chairman and CEO said, okay, get all the findings from this research and just give it to me in the 6 key findings. What is the most important key insights in this research? And it came to the 6 shifts that we call, right? From, let's say, the baby boomers to millennials. It came down to these 6 main shifts. The first one is, if you look in, I'm going to share a slide with you for you to see, but go ahead, we can show the slide, yeah. If you look on the left side of this slide, and we'll get the slide up in just a minute, it shows you really what, let's say, the baby boomers were looking at, saying it's the most important thing within their jobs, within their workplace. And then on the right hand where it says our future, this is where we're really, we're seeing what the millennials are saying, and I'm going to go through each one of these. So baby boomers say, as I said earlier, I want a good paycheck, right? Just give me a paycheck, and that provides for the family, which is the most important thing. Well, millennials these days are saying it's not just about the paycheck, and we're not saying that pay is not important, right? We all know that we can't retain people if we're not paying them. What they're saying is they're looking for more than just a paycheck. They're looking for a purpose. They want to find purpose at their jobs. They're no longer saying that I want to be satisfied at work. They're saying I want to be developed. And this becomes a very, very key theme, especially as we look into the future of work, which I'll discuss a little more later. Millennials no longer say that I want a good boss or I want a boss. They say I want a coach, right? I want somebody who can coach me and develop me. Millennials say, I don't want these annual reviews anymore. Give me an ongoing conversation, right? You look at the world today, kids, they grow up having instant feedback conversations through text messages to all these various channels, Facebook, social media, and then they get to their jobs and then we give them like an annual review in the form of a score, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're saying, look, that doesn't really work for me. I need somebody who can give me ongoing conversations, coach me, develop me. Here's another interesting thing. They say, look, focus on my strengths, right? If I'm doing something good, if I'm doing something bad, don't focus on the things that I'm doing bad. Tell me where my talents are. Tell me where my strengths are and help me develop that. And here's the last one. It's no longer a job like our baby boomers were saying. They're saying this is life, right? My job is my life. So you look at these 6 things. They seem very subtle, but they're very, very significant in terms of what it means and how this shapes our management system or needs to shape our management system. So the first one is I want purpose in my job. Number 2 is I want development. I want somebody to develop me. Number 3, I want a coach. Number 4, I want ongoing conversations. Somebody to help me focus on my strengths and help me develop those. And this is my life. What we're finding in terms of, so we do these global studies around engagement, where we know that, we classify folks into 3 segments of engagement. We have what we call the engaged group. These are the folks who are extremely engaged in their workplace. They'll give discretionary effort. They're psychologically committed. They'll go that extra mile. On the flip side of it, we have what's called actively disengaged, right? So this segment of your workforce are those who literally hate being there. They feel miserable, and they're more than happy to share that misery with those around them. And then that middle group is what we call the not engaged group. Not engaged group they're there. They're there for a paycheck. They're not psychologically committed. They'll work their hours. They'll go home when it's time to go home. Yet given a chance to get more paid to another job, they'll go ahead and take that other job, right? So we look at these 3 segments and we measure them across. We know for a fact that for the past about decade globally, the percentage of engaged has been flat around like 15%. If we dig a little bit deeper, the least engaged generation is millennials, right? Now, as we dig in even deeper into it and we actually look at of the millennials who are engaged, we're also finding that perhaps this generation is one of the most committed groups that we've ever seen. So you go, well, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that our management system so far, and even today, for most of the world, is designed to serve what's on the left side of these things. A paycheck, satisfaction, boss, annual or quarterly reviews, focus on weakness. And those are the things that our management systems are built of, and we have yet to really evolve and to meet the needs of the newer generations, right? That's why we look at a lot of the millennials job hopping. You have all kinds of things going on today globally, different opportunities, the gig economy. There's all kinds of opportunities for them to leave and not be committed to work because they're just not getting engaged at work. Our systems are not built to be to have the newer generations be engaged to their organization. Now, that was really the key finding around the millennials. And this has really sparked on to other things like future of work. So when we started digging in and doing research around, so what is the future of work? So we understand that, you know, today we have you look at just globally, there's about 70% of the organizations today are dealing with millennials. And it's only going to get larger and larger and larger. When we look at that, we say, well, what are some of the other issues? So we embarked on another study called The Future of Work. And there were all kinds of matters that really start popping up, things like diversity and inclusion, things like the impact of the gig economy, the things like women in the workplace. And these were all the 52 points that if you look at in the book that really we go deep into, things like diversity and inclusion. You know, what are the three main things about those diversity and inclusions that organizations need to focus on? To, you know, what is the role of artificial intelligence and how does that impact the future of work? And when we look at all these different themes, and we go to, and organizations ask us, okay, so we get what's going on, right? It's covered in 52 different insights. What do we do about this? The point of the book, just like the title suggests, it comes down to the managers, right? It comes down to the managers that leaders select to manage teams in their organizations, right? 70% of variance in engagement goes directly back to the managers. So how do we understand, number one, how are we selecting managers? Number two, how are we developing managers? Number three, what kind of tools, what kind of training, what kind of things are we providing managers so it really empowers them to engage these newer generations, future generations? And really that's what the point of the book, it really boils down to: what is the manager, who are they, and how do we set them up for success? Okay, I'm just going to pause right there. So that's really, that was my 10-minute recap of what we have here. Yender, maybe I'll turn it over to you. We can get into specific questions to anything that we might have.
Fantastic. Thanks, Take. A really good overview. Guys, we're getting to the next part of the webinar, which involves me sort of asking Take several questions that sort of came out of the first session, and then you guys will have an opportunity to ask any questions you would like. So I'm going to be the sort of very pale version of Trevor Noah, Take, if you can imagine that, on The Daily Show, and I'll be asking you some questions coming out of your presentation. Part of what struck me when we were talking is that there seems to be now a coalescence around things like employee engagement, performance, management, and management systems, and so forth. How do you guys link that sort of in the future of work around the Gallup mission, around empowering people, disrupting positively organizations and change? How does that connect for you?
Sure. You know, if you look at really the value that Gallup provides to a lot of our organizations, clients across the globe, is around our ability to have great analytics and great advice around it. You know, the key theme, as I was explaining, you know, when we're talking about the managers and all this, is really around development. And development gets, you know, if I was to go around, and I've done a lot of work with a lot of clients across the globe, if I was to go around and ask, you know, senior leaders, CEOs, what is development? You know, I'll get 100 different versions of what that means, right? And in a lot of organizations that I've seen, it's still around, you know, they consider development more like promotions, or, oh, well, it's a pay increase. Oh, we'll send them to this training, that training. we rarely even see training as a development function of development, right? A lot of that gets, well, that's an HR thing, right? We never really think about what development is. Yet, when you ask the actual millennial generations to the workforce today, what does development mean to you? You know, it really goes back to the 6 key points I was talking about. Things around like coaching, ongoing conversations, things around, hey, what's my strengths, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a coach, do you know what my strengths are, right? Or in the previous generation, as a boss, do you really understand what my strengths and how to develop me around those, right? Instant feedback. These various different points around development becomes very central and a key theme to a lot of things like around empowering people, right? So you hire great talent, and really you should be developing them and empowering them to do what they do best and to really just fully, use their talent to fruition and turn that into strengths. But we're really just kind of far from that. A lot of organizations today are still set up in a system where it's very hierarchical, seniority based. Still a very structural boss with annual reviews, and it's this structure that really staggers development. And so it really makes you want to say, look, one of the first things we need to do is go back and look at our management system and get a real objective view on what it's doing, how it functions, and in practice, how does that relate to any of your business outcomes, and even things down to turnover.
Take 2 things strike me from what you're saying, and with our work here in South Africa, 2 things happen. When you work with managers, you speak to managers, they say, listen, my job is tough enough already. I spend all my time in meetings, I'm running around doing emails, I'm doing technical work, and now I've got these 10, 11 people that I need to look after. What do you want me to do? Attendant to that, our market, values MBA graduates highly. What do you say to managers in terms of their development?
Yep.
And then conversely, when you work with the HR community and you say, well, we've got to empower people, and by the way, that means we have to trust them, and it turns organizational design on its head, they look at you as if you are a total lunatic. I'm putting that precisely. So talk to us a little bit about what is the real work of a manager and how do we educate them, and perhaps a little bit about what a good job should look like.
Yeah, great question. Interestingly, when you go observe, literally you do nothing but observe what happens in teams. Let's say you go and observe, just a day in the life of a manager. A big portion of what they do is very transactional. A big portion of their conversations that they have, the quality of conversations that they have with their teams are also very transactional, right? And I always think sales teams are a great example of this, right? And I was a sales manager for a very long time, and I can attest to this. You kind of get into this habit of talking about goals, talking about updates, activities. It becomes very, very transactional. The best thing organizations can do, and the best thing the managers can do to understand where they're at, where their team, and how they're doing, and how to improve performance, is to really guide them around understanding the other side of humans, right? So instead of just talking about goals on a daily basis, instead of talking about targets and all these things, it's really allowing the managers to, number one, have the right tools, have the right systems, and having really the time to allow them to go and know more about their people. Things around, one of the greatest questions that I've learned to ask is asking, my team, what does development mean for you? Right? You ask managers today, a big population of them will just tell you, well, they'll make an assumption on something. It means a promotion, it means a pay raise, it means a this. But if you actually go, when managers take the time to start having these great non-transactional conversations that has to do with the person, there's just so much they can find out. And when they start taking care of their folks, and they start taking care of their teams, really understanding and individualizing them, you start seeing the massive improvement in terms of performance. You really dig into things like team's well-being, and that really creates a lot more engagement, and engagement turns into higher productivity.
Take, when I tell managers this, intuitively they get it. And then I say to them, right, so how do you have great conversations with people? And they look at me and they go, I don't know how. Talk to us a little bit about what you mean by, so from boss to coach, I think we have an understanding of that, but what is actually workplace coaching? Because sometimes some of the more cynical managers that I talk to go, does that mean I have to run around and hug people all the time?
Yeah. It's interesting you ask, because that is so common, right? So when I go speak to managers in our client organizations, when we do a lot of these observations, again, it's like, listen, I don't even know where to start, right? I've had clients and even senior leaders I've worked with, and one of the things that we do is, first of all, the frequency of conversations needs to change, the intervals, right? So instead of using these annual reviews, quarterly reviews to really check the box, start having conversations on a weekly basis. It doesn't mean that, you're Monday, Tuesday, it's not any of that. Have genuine conversations. And sometimes it's not even like, well, I have to talk to them for at least an hour. No, it's ask good questions, right? We've in the past, and I'm not somebody who's for, don't script these questions, but it does help having some sort of a guide where they can start off with, because a lot of these conversations turn a lot more genuine. It becomes a lot more natural. But in the beginning, if you've had very transactional relationships with your teams for 10, 20 years, it just feels a little awkward and counterintuitive to start asking them about things that really matter, right? I've had a team that we've worked with, and we actually provided them a guide, and we have various different things. We have guides, things called like 5 conversations, all these different things. But we've had senior leaders. I had one specific case where we actually gave them a guide that has to do with around engagement, questions that relate to people's strengths, being strengths-based, engagement-focused, and number 3 is around just performance orientation. And we had this activity that we're doing where they get to call one of their direct reports just on the phone and have a good 20-minute conversation. And the guy looks at me and goes, "Look, I've known this guy for 20 years. He's worked for me for 20 years. I know everything he needs to. I know everything about him, possibly." So we go, "Okay, listen. I mean, it can't possibly hurt. Why don't you go ahead and try these, questions around these 3 main themes?" He comes back an hour and a half later and goes, "You know what? I learned more about this guy in the last hour and a half than I've known in the last 20 years."
Yeah.
And this is just one example. What it really hints at is, yes, we've known people for a long time. They've worked with us. Luckily, if they haven't left us, they've worked with us for a long time. But especially the newer generations, the millennial generations and on, they actually want these conversations. They need these conversations, right? So in the past, it might have worked because people are there for that paycheck satisfaction, all that stuff. Now it really requires for managers to be more coaches, right? Managers to have these coaching conversations, the ongoing conversations, talk about people's strengths, development. And you might start with a guide, but eventually they really start understanding after they start hearing these answers and the feedback from their direct reports.
I think that's great. I think what resonates with me is I often tell leaders, just be who you are. Because they have some sort of hierarchical, functional view about what a boss is. And if they just switch that off and talk to people like a fellow human being, it's amazing how transformational that can get, especially if you work with strengths rather than weaknesses. Makes sense to me. Talk to us a little bit about this sort of the HR component, because the HR community gets very uncomfortable when we say, well, we just need to redesign jobs, or we need to empower people and we have to trust them and create great jobs. And they go, well, that's not in the policy. The Ministry of No comes out. What advice would you give to them?
I'm going to just focus a little bit on this notion of engagement. I think we need to have a much better balance around an HR initiative and a local empowerment, right? A lot of times even in the topic of engagement, it becomes a very top-down, pure engagement, let's say, initiative. But if you think about it, even if we look at, what changes engagement, what improves engagement, it's really a local phenomenon, right? Then you got to ask the question, are we really set up to empower our managers to work on that engagement piece, right? And a lot of times the answer is no, right? Engagement still becomes a very kind of check the box type of activities like, here's your score, go do your action planning. It's like, okay, once you do your action planning, check off so we know that you did it. that's not really equipping managers with the right tools to the engagement, right? How do they know what people's strengths are, or are they just kind of assuming what they are? How do they know what kind of conversations they need to have? Are they still really in this line of transactional conversations, right? So these are really you don't have to rehaul or redo everything that you're doing today. It's really about understanding how do we get a lot of what we're doing, kind of top-down approach, to inserting that into local empowerment, so the managers start really adopting it, understanding it, and start using that to engage their teams.
And then there's always the question around, well, that sounds great in theory, but it won't work in South Africa. We have a very strong unionized workforce, and trust in leaders at the moment in our country seems to be at an all-time low. What would you say to that?
It's interesting. When we look at things like diversity, inclusion, so all these other things that we're finding out, one of the questions that we really dig into is around things like around trust, respect, and I can tell you, having worked in Asia, Europe, Latin America, all these various different regions, every country will say, listen, we're very unique, and I'm not saying they're not, and it won't work here because of A, B, C, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? When we look at our engagement science, one of the things that we understand is that there's a very basic human need in a workplace element to this, a very basic need. So you might be bounded by laws, systems, to what have you, but that basic need doesn't really change. So as an organization, you might individualize that, to match, and navigate around what other barriers you have around. But this idea around needing to empower locally, that need doesn't really go away, right? So for organizations and for leaders, they need to really sit down, put their heads together and understand, okay, how do we do this?
Absolutely, makes sense. I think we've now almost have more questions than we have participants. So I'm going to segue now into the questions, and bear with me as I ask. So Susan says, a question for me, which I often have discussions with managers about, is why are they so resistant to reverse coaching from their millennials? It seems to me a security issue.
It really goes back to that earlier point I was making. The leader who told me, look, I know everything about this guy. Right? I think we as managers, and I'm even speaking about myself, is that we tend to get into this flow of I know everything, right? I already know what development means for this person. I already know what's important, but rarely do we take the opportunity to ask that. I mean, I think as humans in general, we're just not really good at asking good questions, right? Yeah. And you'll be surprised by the type of answers you get when you ask that question. Now, I think it's this general assumption that we make about what we think people need that kind of keeps us guarded from actually being a little more vulnerable and asking the question and accepting what people are saying to us.
Yeah. It also goes to the heart of, when you start to move from boss to coach, it's a change process in its own way. And sometimes our employees look to us to know all the answers and get very disappointed when we go, you know what, we actually don't know, but let's get together and work on it. So I think it's also, we've got to set up some of those parameters from that. Anthony's asked an age-old question, and I'm glad he's asking you, not me. So he's asking, what difference do you see between managers and leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you actually look at, let's say, our research and how we classify different kinds of roles in organizations, we look at team leaders, and then we also look at just, let's say, overall leaders, right? So team leaders are those who directly lead teams. Let's just say those are managers. That has to do with everything around engaging and focusing on their local teams, right? Leaders have a component of that, but it needs to amplify a lot more, right? Around the strategies, communication, the things that they do needs to go beyond just let's say their first direct line of direct reports. And it takes number one, it takes a very different kind of talent. Number two, it takes a lot of understanding holistically for leaders. What are the implications of these strategic changes to all that directional changes, and all the way down to how that relates to the local members, right? So it's a really different function and roles, and I think it also requires a lot of different demand in terms of what they need to do.
Great, makes sense. Chris Kowalski has asked a very long question, but I'm going to paraphrase. Chris, if I mess it up, please bear with me. He's asking the question that the managers don't get it. How do we as sort of coaches, workplace coaches, other coaches, help them to get it? In his terms, to catch it, I suppose.
I think that's a great question, and that's always going to be a struggle because, you know, we're like a few decades into the same management system we have, right? So it's, you know, going back to that whole transactional conversation to having more frequent, ongoing, you know, let's say meaningful conversations. A lot of the times, in my opinion, and don't get me wrong, there will always be managers who don't get it and who never will. But we always have to make an attempt. I told you we actually provided a guide before that helps them start these conversations. They need to start hearing it. Once they know what kind of good questions to ask and they start hearing the actual feedback from their teams, you know, I would say a lot of the great managers and really talented managers, they start to understand it. And having said that, there are a lot of managers who are not talented managers, right? So there is a distinction there, but you know, those managers who are very talented, a lot of times we'll see that they do this very naturally. And kind of the mid-segment, sometimes you just have to guide them a little bit, have them practice a little bit, have them try it out, where they start hearing the feedback and they start actually realizing, oh wow, I didn't know this, right? Just like the leader example I was giving you earlier. Hey, I know everything about this guy, and an hour and a half later, he goes, wow, I didn't know any of that, right?
No, exactly. Thanks for that. Kalani's asking, what is your view on self-directed work teams or mission-directed work teams that operate without a manager?
I think that's a very interesting question, and it's really interesting study to actually look at these teams. If you look at just in the literature around leadership, there are various different kinds of leadership, right? Leadership isn't always about having one person leading others. Sometimes there's group leadership. Sometimes even within groups, there are informal leaders, right? And a lot of these groups, when you look deeply into them, there's always some sort of leadership that happens, right? Even if it's a group leadership, even if it's a informal leadership, I do believe there's always something that happens. It's an interesting phenomenon, but you know, that's really a leadership phenomenon that happens, and that keeps the group intact and has them moving along. Obviously, there are teams where it doesn't happen and they kind of fall apart, but there is something that happens around leadership within teams.
I think that's right. If nothing else, there's always somebody with an activator strength that gets going. So, and then the conversation happens. Yep, absolutely. Masanka's asking an interesting question. How does the manager change the perception of the executive who micromanage and take away their authority? So here's a little bit of a view from a South African perspective that managers are the marzipan layer in the cake. They get squeezed from below from staff members, and then the executives tend to trample all over their patch.
Yep. Great question. You know, having worked in Asia for so many years, I've seen a lot of similarities, right? So very hierarchical, kind of top-down approach. You know, forget empowerment. Like, here are the rules and here's what you do. It's very tough, and I think that's probably why we're seeing a lot of these kind of generational struggle, because the newer generations are feeling like, hey, I mean, this is not how workplaces should be. Yet it's been a hierarchical, seniority-based system, meaning a lot of the folks on the top are from previous generations, right? I'm not sure if there is an answer to today saying, well, here's what's going to work. But a lot of the times, I mean, you kind of have to lead with data, right? Especially for leaders to see, you have to lead with data, right? If you want to look at things around like engagement and how it relates to all kinds of different performance outcomes, that's a great data point to really go to leaders and say, look, I mean, look at the data in your own organization, right? So that's the analytics piece. And then the advice piece that follows is critical, right? So then what does work? Because a lot of times, especially in senior leaders, they do want to lead with data. They do want to know the proof for why we need to change.
Exactly. Etienne saying, listen, even if a manager is well trained and a generous coach, there's no guarantees, right? Sometimes millennials just leave.
Absolutely. And that really goes down to motivation. It also goes down to talent. One of the things I didn't mention is around fit, right? Not everyone is fit to do a certain job, right? Sometimes their talent, their motivations lie somewhere else, and yes, they are going to leave. Having said that, if you, as a manager, understand how to engage, let's say they're millennials or whatever generation it is, that goes a long way. That goes a long way in terms of, and even shifts in terms of how people view their careers. And especially, as I was saying earlier, if they can find purpose in that, that goes a long, long way.
Interesting question from Howie P10 Light. I'm hoping that's not a first name, but let's jump in. He says, I've lost a few millennials in a sales role in the last few months. The common written reason is they don't understand the impact they make on the organization. Yet when I speak to them a few months later, they say it was because they were not making enough money or they wanted a better position. So it kind of contradicts the fact they want a purpose. I will listen for a response on this.
Yeah.
What's your view there, Teg?
As I said earlier, when I was talking about the shift from paycheck to purpose, we're not saying money is not important, right? So if they're, let's say, very underpaid, or someone's coming at them with, we'll double your pay, they will always be tempted, right? Having said that, that doesn't keep them in that job. They might go to another organization because they doubled their pay. That doesn't mean they'll probably stay there forever, right? Because at the end of the day, the deep core of what they're looking for is a purpose, not just more pay.
Yeah. And Teg, it also strikes me that exit interviews are notoriously difficult to nail down in terms of trust and valid feedback. So it also could be a bit of a halo around that. Trisha has, go for it.
Sorry, and I want to say, if you actually look at our research, interestingly enough, the younger generations, you look at, what attracts them to a new job. Compensation actually falls below things like opportunities to learn, quality of their managers, and having an interesting work. And that's just purely from the research.
Yeah. So Trisha has probably one of the best questions I've come across. She says, as a millennial, how do I manage stroke lead baby boomers? I feel I relate to them on a parent-daughter level, and half the time they don't get the millennial point of view. Man, we see that often.
That's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer, except that, yes, I agree.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah. Perhaps I can help out here. Tricia, this is a fantastic question, and well done in terms of your promotion. Obviously, you're on the fast track, which is great. What we've seen in team dynamics workshops particularly is that the strength language gives an opportunity for people from very different generations to engage with each other on a level that is not hierarchical. It is not an age issue, but it's just a common human-to-human connection. And once we start to explore that, what tends to happen, and you'll know what I'm saying, is that we had a very good workshop where we had a really stuck in the mud 50-year-old plus white Afrikaans male person going, for the first time I know how to talk to people without annoying them, irritating them, or somehow stepping on people's sensitivities around race, gender, and other things. And I think it's about finding a language that is positive, that helps people understand each other and helps connect. We wouldn't advocate parent-daughter because I think that naturally puts you in a different type of position. Teg, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Yunder, because a lot of the work obviously that we do within teams to, let's say, manager direct report relationships, we do have that lens around strengths, right? Which tends to, in a lot of ways, I think, it kind of blurs the other stuff, right? Age to all these different things, and really puts you in a very positive light in terms of, so how can we do this, right? What are the strengths that we have? How do we blend them? and you start really getting more focused on the outcome and the performance on how we can do this together, rather than getting into, well, what's our differences and why are there barriers?
Yeah. Take you put a finger on something that really struck me at the conference is diversity and uniqueness is mission critical, but inclusion is better, where you create an environment for belonging. And that belonging needs to be constructed. You can't assume it, and you won't know until you ask. So yeah, I think those are all great points. And Milani's asking, what is your opinion on a leader or manager of a team not being competency led, i.e. development leader is not an ex-developer, but rather a people's person? So I think there's a skills versus strengths issue here that might be cropping up. I don't know, take what your view is.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of organizations who are very competency focused, and I think competencies are great tools and all that. But a lot of times, to me, competencies are also just outcomes, right? You're kind of looking at a certain desired outcome, as opposed to when you get into the lens of strengths, talent, all these different things. It kind of gets you to understand. So how do we get there? Like, what do we have? What do I have? And how do I get to a certain outcome? Right. So the level of conversation, in my opinion, there's a big shift. There's also a different view towards understanding who I am and how do I get to a certain desired outcome or whatever, what have you.
Yeah, it also sort of strikes me around this that I always think about competence as a skill, which it is, but I can be a competent project manager, but that doesn't tell me how I'm going to execute or how I'm going to influence or build relations or be strategic in that environment. And I think the combination of perhaps strengths and skills comes into play here.
Yeah, and I also think, one of the things around working, like being competent and all this, we kind of miss this whole thing around so what's my strengths? And we all know that not everyone has the same type of strength, same amount of intensity of strengths, talent. It's, it builds a lens into understanding. So how do I build this up to get to that outcome, to get to this, to get to a certain performance outcome?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I always think if you could be a project manager, an achiever will be do a project in a very different way to somebody that's using restorative as an approach, for example. Right, Jeanette, this seems great. So should you have another generation in your team too, do you still follow this or do you adopt to each generation's needs? So I think a bit of a generation diversity question there, Tay.
Yeah, so people ask me this when I say, well, there was a bit of a shift when we asked baby boomers to talk about their families. And then, we get to the millennials and there's a subtle shift. And then people go, well, what about the X generation? Why don't you talk about those guys?
Yeah.
It's hard to predict when these subtle shifts will all happen. Having said that, it's also the reality that given, any point in time, you're going to have about 3 to 4 different generations working in the workplace. And I think that's where we focus on millennials today, because I would say that's the big majority of what we're seeing in the workplace. And in the future, I'm sure it'll change. But having said that, it's really the speed to getting to those needs and having our management system set up to do that. Obviously, our point of view is that strengths kind of, provides you that worldview that you can really just be a lot more agile in terms of how you're getting to those things. And really shifting our management systems. But the reality is that you'll always have these different generations, and who knows which next generation will have a very different view and need.
And I think that the management or team management trick around this is to try and get value and let everybody contribute intentionally. We've often had team dynamics workshops where the people with grey hair in the room are providing great input, but nobody's listening. Or the activators are getting going and they're getting impatient because some people have to think through things first. And if you can get that balance right, you can start to get agile wisdom, which is the combination we tend to want to look for teams, where you get the generational diversity, then really adding value, I think. Lamcorsi says, how do we use coaching to assist organization change culture and leadership style? I think that's probably a 5-day work program by itself. Take?
Yeah, I think, so I do want to gauge on one thing, right? So if you look at even the book, it kind of starts off with basically saying the will of the world has changed. And then it starts presenting to you these various different data points, and especially around productivity, right? GDP, productivity, all these various points. I think there's always got to be an aim, right? It's great to have engaged, happy people at work, but there's always got an aim towards performance, in my opinion, right? And that always provides a very clear destination towards what you're coaching leaders, why they need to change. It really adds that value element to what the purpose of all this change is. So even with leaders to teams, there's got to be a way to measure, and with an end goal in mind, understanding why this change is necessary and how effective the change is being.
Yeah, yeah. And what we really appreciate around Gallup and Gallup coaching is the intentionality. There's always should be a point to doing some stuff. Firas is saying, this is great. What advice would you have to millennials to bridge the gap so that they can find baby boomers and X's in a more positive way?
Yeah. I was once working with a client, and their senior leader, after we went through the whole millennials and what we're finding and all this, he said, okay, so what do we do to make the millennials change and cater to what we provide and what we need? I kind of looked at it like this, right? So in that organization, I think it was like around over 80% of the entire population of the organizations were millennials. And I said, well, it's probably easier to cater towards millennials, in my opinion, because number one, it's unlikely that this need will reverse. And number two, it's probably the most, worth your back to actually focus on the millennial needs. But again, I'm going to go back to the point that having a different lens really does help. And when we talk about applying the strengths, lengths, and all this stuff, isn't always about having all the other generations cater to what millennials need. Yeah. It's really around adding that common language, right? So rather it's the other way around, whatever it is, but it's really trying to break down a lot of the other barriers, the variables, and adding a perspective where people can start seeing eye to eye and speaking that same language.
Yeah. And I think also it's about millennials shouldn't walk around as masters of the universe approach. It reminds me of the year 2000 when the IT guys suggested that we were all going to go into the Middle Ages because of the year 2000. Come New Year's Day, nothing happened, and we had been sort of bowing down to their demands on pay and everything else. So I think that there's a humbleness on both sides. Guys, we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to take 2 or 3 more very quick questions. Anonymous, you have a fantastic question. He says, I'm over 50, but I'm a millennial at heart. In other words, I'm a hip manager. Is that possible?
Absolutely. On the contrary, I'm a millennial, but I tend to think more like the next generation. So I personally think it's very, very possible. And I've seen so many different leaders, managers across who are not millennials, but they're absolutely in the mindset of millennials. So there's nothing wrong with it, and I think it completely exists.
Yeah, and anecdotally, we know that there's some people that are young at heart. So let's crack on. Guys, I'm going to take one last question before we need to close. It does seem, and thank you for all your questions. We're not going to get through all of them. It does seem next time we'll do an hour and a half. What great questions. Caroline's saying, yeah, we get this thing about millennials, but they want to move quickly through the ranks and get money and promotions and all that good stuff. But sometimes the company just needs them to stick around and learn some more stuff. What would you say there?
I would actually go back to our data. And yes, they want it. It appears that they want instant gratification, fast promotions, more pay, and all this. But again, I'll go back to when we look at our millennials data, and obviously I shared the 6 points, but there's a lot of numbers behind it. Yeah, a lot of numbers behind it. When you start asking, what really attracts you to a job, what really keeps you there, what really basically makes you leave, it always points back to the development piece. And I think I'll tie that to, most managers and leaders' assumption that development means promotion or development means more pay. And I'm not saying it doesn't to some people, I'm sure it does. But when you look at a much larger data set as a generation, it seems very counterintuitive, but it actually points more towards development. Excellent.
We're going to crack on with 2 last very quick questions. Sam asks a great question. the strength stuff sounds good, coaching sounds good, but then don't I lose control of my performance and my discipline in my team?
Wow, that's a great question. I again will point to the data. The data will speak almost counterintuitively, but it goes back to this point around empowering actually will increase engagement, and engagement increase the performance. You know, I came from, in my previous world, very hardcore sales teams where it was really about control, all this. But I tell you, understanding the people in my team and understanding how to take care of their engagement usually gives me a lot more, and I say usually personally, but there's a lot of actual data that shows that that actually increases performance rather than the other way.
Ted, unfortunately, we're going to have to call it a halt here. For those questions that I haven't been able to answer or Ted hasn't been, please feel free to email Makrit or myself. We will engage with your questions offline, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. Ted, from our side, thank you very much for your time. I thought a fantastic engagement, and I think you've given us a bit of a peek behind the Gallup veil around It's a Manager, and then I think there's clear reason why it's a New York Times instant bestseller. I was lucky to see Jim Clifton and Jim Harter speak about it at the conference, and I have to say there's some depth to that. For all our participants, very seldom have I seen such great questions all in one webinar. Clearly it resonates with you and you have some really great challenges. I hope that some of the answers we've managed to provide will give you some clues. Can't pretend that we've solved world peace here, but giving you some clues as to what we think are important from that perspective. Before we say goodbye, our final goodbye, I'm just going to reshare the slide, if I can. No, slides. Makrit will come help me here. Just on the 6 shifts that you are recommending that we make from the book. And from that perspective, we will end the session.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yender, Makrit. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you very much for the great discussion and questions.
Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, participants, these are the moves that we need to make for our future work and some of the thinking around the leader as a coach. And then, of course, if you need any additional information, feel free to contact us at info@bhgroup.africa. From Makrit and myself and Take's point of view, thank you very much again. Fantastic webinar. Hope to see you next time. You will get the webinar as a recorded piece sent to you via email. From our side, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.